So if it is Thursday, normally at around 10:30, we get to hang out with Jonathan Feingold because we do race class. But today we're going to take two bites at the race class apple. We're going to do episode number 24 and episode number 25 together because we took November off, but we're not going to take December off. So we're going to combine November and December, and you're going to get two classes, not just one. And I want to remind everyone why we do race class. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and me, Arnie Arneson, offer race class, a once a month, in this case, now once every 2 months, course conversation where listeners can hear what it is like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history, rather than fear and anxiety. So let me welcome back to the program, Jonathan Feingold. Thank you so much for doing this, Jonathan.
Hey Arnie, nice to be with you. And I did not realize that COVID remained so pervasive.
Yeah. Well, that's why I thought I would just sort of raise my hand and say, just to let you know, for those of you who have not gotten your booster, or for those of you who may decide not to wear a mask in certain settings, at least be aware that if you are frail from a health perspective, you may want to reconsider your behavior. Just before we get into this, I do think there's something really interesting about the decision we made almost like 2 years ago to do race class. And what was one of the reasons we decided to do this, Jonathan? It was in part because of the war and the attack on public education by people like Moms for Liberty. Think about that. And what have we learned just this week about the founder of Moms for Liberty, about her husband, Ziegler, the chairman of the Republican Party in Florida, and their actual personal behavior as they attack the discussion of race and racism and LGBTQ and critical race theory that no one ever taught. And we find out that they've had sort of, how do I describe it, as a sordid background and relationship. And as they are trying to sort of tell us how to behave, I'm looking at their behavior and I'm thinking, oh, how fascinating. They made sure that the world was distracted, and yet they had a license to do a menage a trois, to do rape, to do whatever. And I think the irony of who they are and their agenda, attacking public education and trying to cleanse it of anything that didn't fit with their sort of political values, is so fascinating, given that 2 years ago, in some ways, they were the inspiration for me to reach out to you and say, Jonathan, I don't want to run away from this discussion. I want to really dig deep into this discussion, because I think in the end, it'll make us a better country, it'll make us more humane, and it will figure out how to find the Velcro and the words to use together and not be threatened and frightened. So I just thought it was just fascinating as I'm reading about the Zieglers and knowing their history, thinking, oh my God, am I so glad we did this. So thank you on that level, because they were in part my inspiration for finding you and saying, will you teach race class? And I think that it's sort of interesting that this is how we've come full circle 2 years later.
Well, I'm also glad that we've been able to do this for the past 2 years. And while I am not sufficiently familiar with the particular example that you're referencing, I certainly think it's should be quite obvious that there's a level of hypocrisy that has anchored a lot of the attacks on critical race theory, some of which we'll discuss today when we get a little bit into the relationship between anti-Semitism and great replacement theory. And connecting that to discriminatory censorship laws that make it more difficult for teachers to talk about white supremacist and anti-Semitic theories like great replacement theory. And the one irony that I guess I'll say now, because it is sort of holiday season, is one person who I'm not going to send a holiday card to, though maybe I should, would be Chris Rufo.
Yes.
If not for his entrepreneurial efforts, we would not have started this podcasty thing, which I think has been, or at least I hope has provided valuable conversation at a minimum for whoever it is that listens in. And so we have an hour today, which is more than normal. Generally, we're at about 28 or so minutes. And part of the reason is because we missed November. And so we wanted to not just lose that time, but also because this is our final race class episode of the calendar year. And it's an opportunity to pull some things together. And but there's also so much to talk about. And so I'm grateful that we have a little bit more time than normal because I do not want to rush through the conversation that we'll have today, which by no means will be a complete or comprehensive one, and has two primary parts and will proceed sequentially. The first is, and I'm sort of really approaching this first part sort of as I would in class, just like sort of asking a question and then trying to work through an answer. And the question is is anti-Zionism by definition anti-Semitism? It's a claim that has circulated increasingly since October 7th, and it's one that deserves attention for various reasons, and we will give it at least some attention in part one to try to just ask this question. Well, is anti-Semitism, excuse me, I'm messing it up again, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? And that's part one. Part two, I don't think we're going to finish part one before the break, but if we do, then after the break, we will focus on discriminatory censorship laws. So these are the laws like Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, like other laws that target critical race theory, the 1619 Project, that are really designed to both stigmatize equality-oriented pedagogy and to silence discussion in the classroom of issues like race, gender identity, and other targeted topics. There's
I'll
just say one more
want,
thing.
go on.
Let me just say one more thing. Is that okay?
Of course, of course.
No, come in. I'll tie it up after you come in.
No. You were talking about what you want to talk about if we get to it in part two. And remember how I began by saying that Moms for Liberty was really in so many ways the invitation. You mentioned Chris Rufo. And then we're talking about what's happening in the classroom. And I just want to read something from the April of 2023. A far-right moms group is terrorizing schools in the name of protecting children. Moms for Liberty has targeted teachers, administrators, parents, and school board members, orchestrating harassment campaigns that left people fearing for their safety and in some cases their lives. And again, it's about their demand for censorship in the classroom. So in an interesting way, how I began with Moms for Liberty really is an invitation to what you wrote about what's happening in the classroom. So all these pieces are connecting, which is why this is such a timely and important conversation. And you're right, we may not get beyond part one, but if nothing else, we need to understand what is happening in the classroom, because are we opening a classroom up for conversation, or are we actually creating an opportunity for increased fear? And that's something I would not like to see. So let's talk about your anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. Are they the same? And I think that it's important for us to understand exactly what do those terms mean and why you say they are actually very different.
So, just to tie up the sort of the beginning, just to sort of set the stage.
Mm-hmm.
So part one, it's asking this question: is anti-Zionism necessarily anti-Semitism? That's part one. Part two, essentially giving a snapshot of a report that I just co-authored on the spread and impact of discriminatory censorship laws. Focusing on both of those things in part because it's both timely, they're both timely, but also because they are integrally connected. And part of what I hope is that we can reveal at least a little bit the connection between the claim that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and the spread of discriminatory censorship laws. And so, as you said, Arnie, we should try to be as precise as possible, and we will offer some definitions, not meant to be authoritative, but just to make sure that we are all on the same page, at least for purposes of this conversation. But I will share before we do that for me, in ways that other episodes have not been, this one feels personal. Mm-hmm. And I think I should share why. So as you know, as a lot of listeners know, I am Jewish. Also someone who has Dedrick Williams would ask us to phrase it as someone who's racialized as white. And I am concerned about anti-Semitism. And I have family members who have, and close friends who have, like much more proximate memories, either themselves or through stories from family, of moments in history when Jews globally were facing incredibly precarious times. Um, but I'm also deeply angry right now, uh, um, because what I see happening, um, in part through the strategic deployment of the claim that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, is actually a power play that increases the precarity that many Jewish people face um, in the United States. And I'll get into that because I think that might feel a little bit counterintuitive to um, some listeners. But also because this is a moment that I think um, is important to, and we'll get into this, but I'm just sort of flagging it, in which um, claims of, at least rhetorical claims of some sort of solidarity with Israel slash Jews is being used strategically to um, corrode the solidarity that's necessary to actually realize a more just society, not just in the Middle East, but here in the United States. And Mari Matsuda, she is at least attributed for use of the term "we will not be used," which is a call that she was making specifically to members of the Asian American community, to recognize their positionality within the United States society and not to, in her words, be used in a way that actually undermines progressive efforts to create a society in which we can all thrive. Um, and Yeah, so for me personally, it's far more sort of emotionally complex than a lot of the stuff that we talk about because of how I'm find myself personally situated in it. Uh, and another conversation we could have, but I don't think it makes sense to have right now, is to what extent does it matter that I happen to be Jewish with respect to the conversation we're having today? Do I enjoy more greater credibility than I would otherwise? Is the story that I just shared um, um, about, entrenching that sort of authoritative positionality to talk about this thing? Um, as a scholar, I'm much more familiar with anti-Black racism, how it manifests, than anti-Semitism. That's getting too far in the wrong direction. But I wanted to start with that personal story because I think it's relevant one way or another, and
Well,
certainly informs how I come to this conversation.
well, you shared with me the open letter from Jewish students at Brown University. And I actually took that letter and posted it. And I want to read one sentence from that letter because, to a large extent, it explains, I think, a little bit of how you come to this conversation and a little bit about how I am trying to process how I want to talk about this conversation. And the Brown University Jewish students wrote, liberating all of Palestine requires revolutionary change, not an eradication of Jews from the land, but a total dismantlement of the apartheid regime occupying it. And I thought it was such a powerful, powerful sentence, Jonathan, because it in a lot of ways, it gave me the idea of how to frame something that I'm having difficulty framing. But I think what's more important is that you make a declarative statement. You say that the idea that anti-Semitism equals anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism, that it is not, it is, the claim is fraught, if not straight wrong, factually, analytically, and that the claim is dangerous for Jews and others. Expound on that.
Yeah, so I'm going to share three main thoughts. And I'd certainly, invite anyone who's listening to follow up after. Like, I'm not suggesting I'm necessarily getting all this right, but these are sort of three provisional thoughts. The first is that the claim is fraught, as you just said, factually, analytically. It's also, I believe, dangerous. I'll explain more, but also could not be more strategic and predictable. But let's get concrete. I also happen to be a lawyer. I'm still barred in the state of California, and I teach law students. And so let's look at some quote unquote law. So yesterday, the U.S. House passed Resolution 894 through some sort of non-standard procedure. The resolution is titled "Strongly Condemning and Denouncing the Drastic Rise of Anti-Semitism in the United States and Around the World." Who could be opposed to that? In the resolution, it concludes with the statement, resolved, comma, that the House of Representatives dash and then number 4 clearly and firmly states that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So that is one example of a claim, could not be more straightforward, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And I want to recognize that, of course, there may be individuals who espouse anti-Zionist views who also espouse anti-Semitic views. There might also be certain manifestations of anti-Zionism that are in certain respects anti-Semitic. But this claim is not that. This is a claim that all anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. Who introduced the bill? David Kustoff, who is, I believe, one of 2 Jewish Republicans in the U.S. House. And it passed widely, like super widely, not without dissent. But I'd encourage anyone to look at Maxwell Frost from Florida, his explanation as to why he voted for it. And part of it was just a recognition of how opponents would deploy the title to go after anyone who voted against this, though he also noted his concern with the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And just one counterpoint that you already sort of flagged, the statement from a collective of anti-occupation Jews at Brown University, offer sort of a different vision, which is that as we grapple with millennia of Jewish struggle and survival, we will not abandon our Palestinian cousins and peers or let them stand alone. And so just zooming out before we get into sort of analytically, well, John says this thing is fraught. Why is this claim fraught? We have 2 very different visions of the world of politics. One is zero sum. So the claim that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic is a zero sum, or at least trades on a zero sum sort of theory of the world and how we might organize. And the other that the Brown students offer is one of solidarity. And I think that matters. So I'm saying the claim is fraught or just plain wrong. Let's be precise. Arnie, you said we should be precise. I'm always telling my law students, let's be precise. So if we're disagreeing, we're at least disagreeing about the same thing. So let's get some definition. So Zionism.
I was just going to go there. I was just going to ask you, define Zionism for me, because I want to make sure we use the term as if we all come to the table understanding what the term means, the history of the term, and how we're defining it for the purposes of this conversation. And is it fungible? Does it have different definitions? I mean, that's the fear. Please, let's talk about Zionism. What are you meaning when you use the word?
So what I'm not offering is some authoritative for all time definition. I'm just describing how I'm using it. And I think that this is broadly consistent with how others are meaning it right now. And now I'm just pulling from a Noah Zatz essay from the Law and Political Economy blog on the conversation we're having now. And I draw on this essay throughout. So I would encourage others to take a look at it. And as he says, Zionism generally refers to the project of a specifically Jewish state in the land of Israel, Palestine, as Israel has declared itself to be since its founding. And specifically Jewish entails, among other things, that if you are Jewish, you are able to access certain rights and privileges that others are not, which is formal inequality that some might say is necessary for various reasons, but it is a formal inequality. And so when I'm using the term Zionism, I mean that, or a little bit more broadly, just Israel as it currently exists. And it's important to note that there are many defenders of Israel, Jewish defenders of Israel, who imagine, who work for Israel that is constructed differently than it is currently. But Zionism, project of a specifically Jewish state in the land of Israel, Palestine, generally understood as the same thing as sort of Israel as it exists right now. So anti-Semitism, let's get a definition there. Again, like obviously one could have different definitions of anti-Semitism. Here I'm drawing on the Nexus Task Force, which was a sort of a group of scholars housed at the time at University of Southern California, I think now maybe in Bard College at an institute there, who come from various places. This is the definition they offered. There's a shorter, more concise version in the Jerusalem Declaration that is similar, but this I find to be useful. Anti-Semitism consists of anti-Jewish beliefs, attitudes, actions, or systemic conditions. It includes negative beliefs and feelings about Jews, hostile behavior directed against Jews because they are Jews, and conditions that discriminate against Jews and significantly impede their ability to participate as equals in political, religious, cultural, economic, or social life. The definition also notes that Israel, as an embodiment of collective Jewish organization and action, is a magnet and often target of anti-Semitic behavior. I like this definition in part because there's parallels with how Khaled Beydoun conceptualizes Islamophobia, in that it is noting both sort of the ideology component, so that would be the negative beliefs and feelings about Jews, the behavioral component, hostile behavior, and the structural component, the conditions that might impede one's ability to participate as equals. And if we want to think sort of capaciously, I think that's useful.
So Stephanie just sent a note and she said, but aren't Palestinians also Semites? Or does that just get discarded and ignored? Because when you, I mean, again, I'm looking at Islamophobia and I'm looking at all these things, and in the end, is the foundational term that it's anti-Semitic. It's anti-Semitic if you're Islamophobic, and it's anti-Semitic if you are doing what you are doing to Jews. And it isn't it interesting? Is this the different side of the same coin?
So a couple things. One is, like, if this were class, then it'd be like, oh, really good point. Let's get into that more. Right now, for purposes of our more limited conversation, I think that's a really nice observation, in part because anti-Semitism, as the term travels, particularly in the United States, is understood as anti-Jewish.
Yes.
Even if someone who is sort of categorically Semitic might not just be someone who is Jewish, but generally it's understood as sort of anti-Jewish, which is how I'm using it now. So then the claim that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is essentially a claim that any anti-Zionist posture or critique of Israel as currently constituted is anti-Jewish. And often, in the way that that sort of claim is being made right now, is that the anti-Zionist posture, so for instance, the claim that the Jewish state should not be sort of an exclusively, or that Israel should not be a state that privileges Jewish people, is not just a critique of Israel or the policies of the Israeli government or military action taken by Israel, but actually is being described as constituting a call to violence, sometimes in quite grand terms, against the Jewish people. And so it is this sort of logical transfer of having claims that are being directed at the state or the policies of the state or the actions of the state as claims that are targeting the people who happen to reside in the state or other places. And to accentuate sort of this rhetorical leap or logical leap, I just want to draw on a statement from Elise Stefanik at a congressional hearing yesterday in which 3 university presidents, including that of Harvard, were asked a number of questions, essentially asked whether or not, or asked a number of questions. And I'm drawing now from an Inside Higher Ed article that describes Stefanik as, in a combative round of questioning near the end of the hearing, she asked each president whether calling for the genocide of Jews amounts to bullying and harassment. Obviously, anyone who is calling for the genocide of Jews or Palestinians or anything else amounts to, at a minimum, bullying and harassment. It's also illegitimate academic discourse. But that claim of calls for violence against people is being conflated with an outpouring of critique against the state as it's currently constituted and its policies and military action.
But
I think we've got to,
Stefanik knew exactly what she was doing because
she knew what she was doing.
She knew what she was doing because it was a blunt statement that wasn't about a critique of Israel. It was about, basically the elimination of all Jews and all Israelis. I mean, it was like she framed it in such a way that it wasn't about, do you agree with the leadership of Bibi Netanyahu? What about the Israeli policies? She made it a much more, it was hard to even hear her talk. And it was actually hard to hear the presidents respond because the language she was using may not actually imply the language that is actually heard on campus, but she made it so extreme. And then she put all those presidents in a defensive mode. I mean, I almost couldn't even watch the television set as I was listening because it made me so uncomfortable, Jonathan.
And I think we have to break. And when we return, we'll talk more. But you are right. She was, could not be a more extreme claim that ideally one in a position of public office is going to make responsibly.
Yes.
But the claim, the way that it was made, was strategic and connected to other claims that reframe criticism of the actions and policies and current structure of the state of Israel with invitation to eliminate a people. And as you said, and at the outset, like that contrasts with the actual statements we are seeing from most, if not all, I won't say all because obviously there are outliers, but at least all of the statements, some of which I have been a part of, many of which that I have seen, have been as clear as possible that the goal is to create a society in which everyone can live free from the threat of violence.
And we need to end this part of the conversation. This is Race Class with Jonathan Feingold. It's also The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We're recording on Wednesday morning. It is episode number 24 and 25 of Race Class. We will be right back. Welcome back to part 2 of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. You know the drill. We're recording on Wednesday morning. We're continuing our conversation, an incredibly difficult conversation with Race Class. Jonathan Feingold has been conducting Race Class now for 2 years. And this conversation, as he even said at the very beginning, is somewhat personal with him. And he's also angry. And I have to tell you, Jonathan, it is also feeling very personal for me. And I am so angry. But we began the conversation with the claim that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. And you brought up the House Resolution 894, that in this resolution that strongly condemns and denounces the drastic rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, makes this provocative statement that says clearly and firmly states that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And as you point out, that's not only straight wrong, but factually and analytically wrong, but convenient to a large extent. And then you mentioned what happened before Congress, where they brought 3 college presidents before members of Congress. And Representative Stefanik basically used her power and her position to challenge these professors. And I will tell you, Jonathan, I told you during the break, I couldn't watch it. Not only was I angry at the words that Stefanik chose to use because the words were clearly cherry picked to be the most extreme, but I was also angry at the three college presidents because instead of recognizing what Stefanik was doing, they kind of referred to a text or a statement that was given to them by their lawyers or whatever that were consulting them. So they didn't actually rise to the moment, Jonathan, because they know about the conversations that are happening on their campus. And 98.9% of that conversation is not what Stefanik did, not what Stefanik used in the way of language. But she knew that if she took out the most extreme, in some way, she played them for exactly how they behaved. She made them look like they were defending anti-Semitism, which is in fact not what they were doing. But she created a scenario, Jonathan, that basically for most of the public and frankly for Morning Joe, because I was watching Morning Joe, they said they were condemning the presidents too. And nobody mentioned what Stefanik did because the presidents were not capable of doing it.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
It should be easy to simultaneously say, well, of course, to the extent anyone is calling for violence
Yes.
or the genocide for the elimination of a people, at a minimum that amounts to bullying harassment, A. B, that is a gross misrepresentation of the vast majority, and I don't know like the precise percentage, but from what I have actually witnessed, um, from the widespread criticism directed at the Israeli government and its military actions now and before, that those critiques, those criticisms, which are widespread, are legitimate academic discourse
Yeah.
and are necessary to be for there to be spaces within our institutions to be discussing those things. And it is a conflation and a dangerous one, as you said, to
Oh,
reframe, to describe statements that target the state, statements like Free Palestine, um, as calls for violence against the people who happen to reside there. And so the Jerusalem Declaration, just as another data point, it um, states that it is, and like all this can be debated, but when the United States House passes a statement that essentially forbids this sort of debate, that's a problem. But the Jerusalem Declaration says it is not anti-Semitic to support arrangements that accord full equality to all inhabitants in, quote, between the
yeah.
river and the sea, whether in two states, a binational state, unitary democratic state, federal state, or in whatever form. But again, one of the collisions that we are witnessing are two visions of the world. One that is zero sum, uh, another that is described by solidarity. But let me just offer a few sort of comparisons, analogies, just to try to, from a different angle, sort of surface why I'm so uncomfortable with the blanket statement anti-Zionism is anti-racism, is anti-Semitism. Or, I mean, but I guess it's a Freudian slip, but one that actually makes sense. So, and these are examples that Noah Zatz uses. So, like Catholic nationalists who reject British rule in Northern Ireland, does eliminating British rule equal a call for genocide against Irish Protestants? Of course not. Is a call to quote unquote smash South Africa's apartheid state the equivalent of a call for genocide against white South Africans? Of course, it is not. Um, or from even a different angle, um, Black Lives Matter. Does the pronouncement that Black Lives Matter or a call for anti-racist politics equal sort of an anti-white or just a racist politics? Or I think like this actually is the most sort of directly relevant. To be pro-Israel, to be pro-Zionist, should that be understood as anti-Palestinian? Always. Sometimes, certainly, there's going to be anti-Palestinian sentiment, but does every pro-Israel statement, in the same way as every sort of anti-Israel statement, does that necessarily mean that someone is anti-Islam, is anti-Palestinian, Islamophobic, anti-Arabic? I I don't think so.
Well,
The point
I
is,
want to stop you
yeah.
for a second. I want to go back to something because, again, Stefanik used these words that probably are rarely, if ever, heard, but someone may have said it, and she was able to use it, and the college presidents were not able to distinguish between what she was doing and their response. So I am very angry at them. All right, but I also want to remind everyone that Bibi Netanyahu held up a map in front of the UN without Palestine. All right. That's what he did. He did that. So he may not have used words, but what did his map describe? Okay. What did his map describe? So again, I mean, Bibi is so clever because he doesn't want to get stuck with the language, but he can show the pictures. All right. And yet there was some pushback, but not significant pushback. And again, I think these things are important because both sides have extreme views. No one's denying that, Jonathan. But the question then becomes, because of those extreme views, does that now forbid us to have a conversation, which is really what I think Stefanik wanted those presidents to say?
So, I am not. So one is you raise an interesting point that I'm going to dig into, but so I've signed a number of letters or been part of drafting a number of letters that try to intervene into ongoing conflicts, often domestically on university campuses. I don't think any statement in any of the letters that I've signed has been extreme. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
all been incredibly modest. Um, and I think that there is a risk that so as you say, the extreme views on both sides. Like, I'm not sure so Stefanik, uh, Israeli officials, some of them that have, or um, right-wing Israelis essentially claiming like quote unquote death to Arabs, like that is extreme, sounds genocidal. To the extent anyone domestically in the United States is claiming what Stefanik described, like they should be unequivocally denounced.
Exactly.
But that is a gross mischaracterization of the dominant claim, of the
Mm-hmm.
dominant critique now, which again is directed at the state and sort of by like comparison. And so Noah Zatz, like he offers this observation, like he's seen no institutionalized effort to charge U.S. demonstrators who wave the Israeli flag with the statements of Israeli officials that are, I think, appropriately described as bloodthirsty, bigoted, and dehumanizing with respect to Palestinians. And so, on the one hand, there is this zero-sum framing, but there's also some degree of disparate treatment, where in Congress has passed a resolution that claims anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. No sort of comparative resolution sort of on the quote unquote other side. And like all the examples that I'm offering are not meant to suggest that contexts are the same. Of course, they are different. Um, but it is meant to just try to um, surface multiple ways in which the claim, again, in the House resolution that anti-Semitism anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is analytically fraught. But we don't have enough time, and we need to get into two other key points. What is that? So why is the claim dangerous, and in what ways is it predictable? Um, so why is it dangerous? I've been alluding to this variously, but I think we should note that either last week or the week before, three Palestinian students in Burlington, Vermont, were shot in
Yeah.
what appears to be a hate crime.
Mm-hmm.
One is now paralyzed from the waist down. Um, of course, it would be um, both analytically and arguably sort of otherwise irresponsible to suggest that one person's statement in one time is responsible for some act, but it's equally naive to suggest that the rhetoric that gets absorbed into public discourse does not in one way or another feed acts of violence like this. And so that incident, which really sort of messed me up a little bit, reminded me of 2015 when three Muslim Americans, UNC students, were shot and killed by their neighbor. It
Mhm.
also reminds me of the Tree of Life massacre,
Mhm.
in which a Jewish synagogue was targeted.
It reminds me of January 6th.
All right,
I
well,
mean,
you could,
all right, I'm just telling you. I mean, words have consequences. The political environment has consequences. The echo chambers have consequences, and we saw that consequence in Vermont.
and I'm making a specific claim that claiming anti-Semitism equals anti-Semitism is part of the rhetoric that actually feeds that. In part for reasons that you actually, I think, articulated in a way better than I did, but either when we were off record or here, but how divisive and corrosive the language is, particularly the sort of language from someone like Stefanik. Because again, the corollary is that if you are pro-Israel, that means you're anti-Palestinian, which cannot be right either. Um, and it forbids any nuance, and thereby undermines the social fabric and solidarity among students, among faculty, among families, because if we're going to be so rigid and dichotomous, you are effectively forced to take a quote unquote side. And there is no side in which we can all just simply be free. And so that feeds the zero sum logic I've been talking about. It's often laden with some sort of white supremacist ideologies. And really, again, the notion that equal right for one is harm to another. It's a standard civil rights, anti-civil rights move that we see all over the place. You can just think with respect to the LGBTQ community, and now the claim that for 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 us to have rights, that infringes on someone else's religious liberty. It is a strategic zero-sum sort of frame. But where else, and we referenced this at the outset, do we see um, of similar sort of zero-sum logic with a clear anti-Semitic dimension that
Mm.
Elise Stefanik has also endorsed?
Wow.
Great replacement theory.
Right, exactly.
So many of the individuals who have committed some of the most atrocious um, mass killings from the past decade have had some sort of manifesto that, in one way or another, or other documents that reference great replacement theory.
Good
Um,
point.
a, the Anti-Defamation League on their website, they've got a section on great replacement theory and its anti-Semitic dimensions. Charlottesville, like what was one of the most chilling
They will not replace us.
chants? They will, who was the they?
Exactly. Exactly.
No, who was the they? Because not everyone
The,
listening is going to know who the they is.
well, they were the Jews. I mean, it was people. Oh God, who is the they? I mean, in a way, it's a collective they, because as long as it's not them, it is the they. I mean, again, it is anti-Semitic. It was anti-black. And there were so many things in the language of "they will not replace us."
And so, and as was documented, after the racist massacre in Buffalo, um, Elise Stefanik on her, I think, Facebook page had rhetoric that was most generously, I think, described as sympathetic to great replacement type ideology. Um, and so it is impossible to take seriously from someone like that or from the broader infrastructure of sort of right-wing media politicians. I am not giving Chuck Schumer a pass. We don't have time to talk about it, but I also find things that in his recent statement to be troubling. But you cannot take seriously um, the GOP's current interest in anti-Semitism
Mhm.
when the party frequently rehearses, weaponizes, disseminates some of the most standard, long-standing sort of anti-Jewish tropes, including notions about, these grand conspiracy theories, great replacement theory, which sort of has a piece in this. Um, but again, it's it's divisive, but And we really just we cannot accept such a shallow even stripping the sort of white supremacist aspect aside, just a zero-sum framing, like such a shallow vision of the world that where only some of us can be free, only some of us can live with security. Certainly it's not the world we have, but I don't think it is extreme to yearn for, to call for, to work for um, a world in which we actually are able to ensure that everyone thrives.
Can I go to Noah
That's,
Zatz? Let me go to Noah Zatz
yeah.
piece because as I'm listening to you, I wish they had read his piece, the college presidents, before they spoke before Congress. Okay, and the reason is not only because they were giving them an ability to listen to the actual words of this what's her name, the congresswoman, but then they could also then have a response. And one of the things he writes is, I think, so important because it goes to exactly what you said, Stefanik. Translating an embrace of Palestinian life and freedom into a call for Jewish death relies on pervasive racist and anti-Muslim stereotypes of Palestinians as endemically hateful, violent, deceptive, and hostile to Jews and Israel aside. I mean, again, I think that's such a powerful statement. It's because you want to be free. Doesn't mean you want the other side to die. That's not the same. That's not the same. And in some ways, Jonathan, that needs to be the song. That needs to be the drumbeat. You're asking to be free does not want someone else to be oppressed. Am I right here?
So, Kiese Layman, who's a well-known writer, he often remarks that the way in which um, movements for uh, um, equality for Black Americans are often so violently um, squashed out is can be understood in part by like the folks who are squashing it out recognizing the degree of violence and subordination that Black people in this country have faced and a worry that it's going to be turned back on them.
Wow.
Which, like, if you actually, which is in all sorts of ways deeply like could not be more inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
But it's sort of contrary to the notion that we don't know our history. It's the notion that we actually do. And the concern isn't that a call for equality is a call for equality. It's a call for turning the table. Um, but if you are fearing turning the table because you fear receiving what you have doled out, and I'm sort of speaking in individualized terms. I don't mean to because I think the conversation is more sort of effective if we're thinking more structurally. But like if you recognize that the system stamps out certain people, and you get some sort of a pass, you're somehow inoculated from it, and you're worried that re, the reconstituted system will deprive you and your family from being able to thrive where someone else can, then like that's sort of understandable in a particular sort of way. But it's also shackled to a very zero-sum notion of how the world can be, and is not listening to or taking seriously the calls for solidarity and equal human flourishing that I see as animating a lot of the uh, anti or the critiques of Israel that we're seeing in the current moment, or that we see, for instance, in the movement for Black Lives with respect to the historical and current Constitution of the United States. But so dangerous, fraught, also predictable. We only have a few more times, so let's talk about why it's predictable that someone like Stefanik would use such grotesque, factually untethered language. Why Jewish Republicans would want to pass a House resolution that, makes an analytically, sort of bizarre, if not fraught claim. Or to put it differently, why is the party, the donors and the think tanks that also oppose Black Lives Matter, caricature Black Lives Matter, that are seeking to outlaw diversity, equity, inclusion, and have characterized anti-racism as itself racist? Why are they making this claim? And it's, you know this better than I do. So I'm going to just hit a couple things. Then I'd invite you to, add on. It's about power and politics.
It is
So
about
one
that.
piece of it is about claiming, asserting the authoritative Jewish perspective and delegitimizing as, not getting it or themselves anti-Semitic, broad coalitions of Jews in the United States and elsewhere who are equally, if not more, critical of the Jewish state or of Israel as currently constituted. So it's about asserting an authoritative perspective. It's about silencing dissent. And we have seen this quite unapologetically from law firms, from billionaires, from donors who have threatened to retaliate against students for making pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel statements. And that is about wielding power to silence dissent. It's about discrediting legitimate discourse. And so this ties back into the congressional hearing that I think we both struggled with. Like,
Oh my God.
The problem with calling for genocide or the elimination of a people is not just that it obviously creates a hostile environment and constitutes bullying and harassment. It's that it's illegitimate. It is not legitimate discourse, which is precisely inapposite with precisely inapposite. I don't know if those two words can actually go together. With critiques of how Israel or any other nation state does its politics, which is the realm of legitimate academic discourse over which we can agree or disagree. But it's also not new. Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib have been repeatedly rebuffed by the Republican and Democratic colleagues for stern words against Israel, oftentimes that invoke Human Rights Watch or Israel's own human rights organizations to evidence their claims of human rights violations under which Palestinians must deal. It's also, and this is sort of connecting the claim to the attack on CRT and all the discriminatory censorship laws that now I will say, even though we don't have time to get into it, cover formally over half of the country, over half of the public school students, and based on an estimate from Penn America, 1.3 million teachers. The claim is both consonant with and undergirding live attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion. Like there are Republican representatives in the past week, I think, argued that one of the reasons why we are seeing a quote unquote rise in anti-Semitism is because of DEI.
Yeah, I know.
Predicated on, the same sort of caricatured notions of what sort of anti-racist pedagogy or values are.
So we only have a minute left. Let me just say something as I'm listening again to you. I'm thinking about Stefanik and thinking about the hearing in Congress. And that is, understand what Stefanik is doing. She is setting this up for Donald Trump. And what is she setting up? The idea that dissent is the problem. That is the problem. So any kind of dissent, whether it's dissent against the actions of Bibi, whether it's dissent against the actions of Israel, whatever it is that now this is where she's now threatening the conversations, not only on college campuses, but across the country, that you now see if you are in dissent, in this case against the actions of Bibi Netanyahu, the way you would be against the actions of Donald Trump, that therefore you are now a threat. And I think we have to understand this is not about the moment, Jonathan. There is so much political baggage in this conversation, but it's not about the moment. It's anticipating what the future may be, and it's an anti-democratic future.
And I will just say that it's been an hour now. Our time's up. I'm not sure how productive the conversation has been, but I would encourage folks to read Noah Zatz's recent essay. I think he does a really nice job, as he tends to do, of making quite clear something that I think is causing a lot of confusion for a lot of folks. And thanks, Arnie, for 2 years of these conversations. And I look forward to picking it back up in 2024.
Episode 24 and 25. The Anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism power play. This is Ray's Class with Jonathan Feingold. This is The Attitude with Arnie Arneson. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.